Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 199 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we welcome back a familiar voice and a profound expert in the field of forensic studies, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Dr. Brown is not only an assistant professor and program director at Concordia University, right here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but also the lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health. His work spans across the spectrums of trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies, making significant contributions to both academic and professional arenas. Jerrod is also the visionary founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, also known as AIAFS, and serves as the editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. With a rich academic pedigree that includes multiple master's degrees, in addition to a variety of graduate certificates, Dr. Brown brings a wealth of knowledge and insight into the complex interplay between criminal behavior and neurodiversity. Now today, we are taking a broad sweep at what goes into criminal behavioral profiling. We'll peel back the layers of Hollywood's portrayal of profiling in hits like Silence of the Lambs and Criminal Minds, comparing and contrasting these dramatizations with the realities of the field. Moreover, Dr. Brown will guide us through the critical role of neuroscience in understanding criminal behavior, emphasizing why today's practitioners need to embrace this emerging field to better serve their clients. So, buckle up as we embark on this fascinating journey with Dr. Jerrod Brown, exploring the depths of criminal minds through the lens of an expert who bridges the gap between academia and practical application in forensic behavioral health. Now please, enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Jerrod Brown. Always a treat to have you on the show and gaining your valuable insights. Why don't we begin? Reintroduce yourself to those perhaps first-time listeners who have not had the pleasure of hearing you speak on the podcast before. And then let's dive into today's topic. I know in the past we have put a fun little series together profiling infamous serial killers. Today, it sounds like we're going to take a step back and look at a 30,000-foot view, I guess you could say, of criminal profiling, some myths, what goes into that, some common terminology. One of the things that you know, Jerrod, I'm always trying to do on this program is negate some of those stereotypes that we get out of popular media, whether it's the 6 o'clock news or Hollywood. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of those myth-busting conversations going on today. But yeah, welcome back to the show, Jerrod. Great seeing you again. Let's kick off the conversation.
You bet. Joe, great to see you, buddy. It's been too long. And yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jerrod. I am a professor. I do a lot of trainings. I do quite a bit of consulting and publishing in a variety of topics. And one of the areas that I've been really interested in for a very long time is why people engage in very serious and concerning behaviors, and serial killing obviously is at the most extreme example. But again, taking those most extreme cases and then reverse engineering them and learning as much as we can about the individual's life histories and even prenatal histories. If that information is available, we can take the concepts that we've learned from these high-profile cases and hopefully apply them to much less severe cases, and using this information to help us be better equipped to maybe identify problematic behavior early on, developing more holistic kinds of intervention and prevention kinds of strategies for really whatever population you work with. If you're working with folks that are engaging in violent behavior, domestic violence, child abuse, substance misuse, whatever it is, a lot of the themes we've been talking about in this series can apply to any population base, because a lot of the common themes that have emerged from us really reverse engineering and profiling these serial killers is that head trauma histories are elevated, trauma histories, attachment problems, family history dysfunction, lots of just social skill deficits, learning challenges, all of these things that you know plenty about, Joe, through the R&R model and dissidence, all those things. So hopefully folks have listened to quite a few of these and are starting to really connect the dots, and we're seeing themes emerge. But really, I should have probably did this episode first to give the overview, but better late than never. So I'm hoping to kind of just introduce all of you to what is criminal profiling, the science behind it, the myths, the facts, the controversies, as Joe said.
Do you want to kick off, Jerrod, with, you mentioned we've got a nice series here that I encourage folks to go back and listen to, but I'm wondering if we should start with some sort of a baseline, or do you want to just, maybe for the sake of illustration, grab out of the dustbin of episodes we've done in the past? Can you think of an individual that we could maybe start with, or you tell me your approach you want to take here?
Yeah, I mean, we've profiled some folks that probably most of you have heard about because there have been movies on some of these individuals and books and crime, TV, blogs, all of these things. We profiled the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. I would highly recommend checking that one out, because out of all the individuals we profiled, I would say his life history seems to be packed with every variable we can think of. If you're into neuroscience, that segment is loaded with neuroscience. If you're into biology, if you're into child development, family dysfunction, the role that kind of intergenerational transmissions of trauma play, prenatal factors, that's a really interesting segment. We did another, I think, really interesting one on Albert Fish. He was a very interesting profile, and I've done a lot of work as it pertains to Albert Fish. He may not be as known to all of you, but if you're in this world, yeah, there's been plenty of writings on him, and he was a mysopede. And I would highly recommend looking at the literature on mysopedes. And if you Google my name and type in mysopedes, you can find a few articles I wrote. This is just my opinion. I could be wrong on this, but people who would be classified as a mysopede, I believe, are the most dangerous type of offender on the planet. A mysopede is really a sadistic homicide offender of children. They have a tendency to engage in overkill, remove body parts of the child in some cases. Very, very, very dangerous individuals, and thankfully they're very, very rare. And again, the folks that we're profiling, most of us will never work with someone that is a Richard Ramirez or an Albert Fish, but we're probably all working with folks that have had a lot of their similar backgrounds. Trauma, again, loaded in their histories. Head injuries were common. Family dysfunction. There's probably some genetic factors to look at, and the list goes on and on and on.
Could I get you to maybe divert a little bit from today's topic? You mentioned neuroscience, Jerrod, which I was introduced to a little bit when I took your your trauma and resiliency graduate certificate, and now I'm absolutely loving the other program I'm involved with that you're a part of. You're becoming a neurocriminology informed professional, and the more I learn, the more I'm almost aghast that the field of corrections is literally blind to this whole area of study. Could you give sort of a neuroscience 101 to criminal justice practitioners to highlight some of the themes that are a part of that discipline, whether it's neuroplasticity or talk about the HPA axis and how that relates to trauma? Again, I felt not only fascinating, but it's got to be out provided to the masses.
Absolutely. And Joe, before I do that, I just want to ask you a question about that. In all of your great work and schooling, have you ever had neuroscience specific training or coursework before you came to the program that I oversee?
No, never. And it made such an impact with me, Jerrod, that regular listeners of the show hear me talk about it all the time, that it really was foundational in the TIDES model that Nicole Kimberly Staley and I developed, our trauma-informed assistance model, because it just struck us both that this has to be a core component of this new approach we're taking. But the answer to your question is no. It's just a crime.
Yeah, I just think anyone that works with people should have some training in neuroscience, especially if you're working in the mental health, criminal justice, human service, forensic arena, because, behavior in general, it's all linked back to the brain. So when we think of neuroscience, the high-level overview is, if you study neuroscience, you're probably going to want to learn about the brain, the different structures, the functions of the brain, the nervous system, how the brain communicates with other parts of the body. If you study mental health, at the core of mental health is neurological, biological factors, physiological factors. If you want to understand mental illness or substance misuse, you have to understand neuroscience. Neuroscience combines all kinds of disciplines: psychology, biology, chemistry, physiology, anatomy, developmental kinds of literature bases. If any of you are running any kind of group, a COG skills program, you're doing interviews, you're doing PSIs, you're an evaluator, whatever you do, if you are teaching a skill, or maybe you're a school teacher, a college professor, look at the educational neuroscience research literature. It will help guide and inform the development of your curriculum, the layout of your classroom or group room, to make it more conducive to the people you're trying to teach. So brain-based teaching strategies, brain-based learning. If you study neuroscience, you're going to want to learn about neurotransmitters, neurohormones, mirror neurons, memory. You mentioned neuroplasticity. If you are working with clients that struggle with reading, attention, learning, memory, calculation problems with math, language issues, self-regulation deficits, emotional dysregulation, social decision-making issues, neuroscience research has all kinds of valuable things that you can learn about that's going to help you better understand some of those things we're talking about. So that's kind of the higher overview. And I guess one other thing I would think too that your audience might find fascinating is there's a whole line of literature on forensic neuroscience. Now you talked about neurocriminology, my work in that area. Forensic neuroscience, I would say, is a component of that, but forensic neuroscience is basically studying the crime-related aspects of neuroscience, and you're probably going to be in a much better position to understand when certain structures of the brain might be damaged or not working properly. How might that play a role in criminal behavior? So, for example, if you study forensic neuroscience, some of the main parts of the brains that are talked about, the prefrontal cortex, which is executive function, problem solving, decision making, reasoning, working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility. It also talks a lot about the amygdala. You remember the recording we did, Joe, on Charles Whitman. After his death, during the autopsy, they found a tumor in his brain pushing on his amygdala. If you want to study criminal behavior and problematic behavior, you got to understand prefrontal cortex dysfunction, amygdala dysfunction, to name a few, the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And one other thing I'll say, people forget about this or may not have ever considered this. Joe, you know it now. But if you want to understand the brain, equally important is to understand the gut because of the gut-brain health axis. Because if your gut is off, digestive health issues, digestive complaints, digestive health disorders, that impacts mood, energy, our hormones, our sleep, our metabolism, the kinds of foods we crave. And the research says if you're working with people that have tons of trauma, they eat very badly, they don't sleep well, they smoke a lot of cigarettes, they're pounding down the energy drinks, their gut is definitely off. So optimizing the gut plays a role in enhancing healthy behavioral outcomes.
Jerrod, I've been around long enough that I could tell people, yeah, when I started my career back in 1988, it was arguably pre-R&R. I mean, it was out there, but we hadn't really embraced the risk-need responsivity framework. And I can tell folks, yeah, I used to work as a probation officer before we knew about risk factors, before we knew about criminogenic need. And in my head, I'm thinking of sort of the ghost of probation future is going to look back at 2024 practitioners and say, oh my gosh, you were working in the field and you didn't know anything about neuroscience. That's crazy. Just as it's crazy for us to think, oh my God, Joe, you worked in probation when you didn't know anything about evidence-based practices. Yeah. I mean, it's the good news is we're getting there, but it's sort of a double-edged sword that it's still frightening that we know.
Can I say two more things, buddy?
Yeah.
About neuroscience.
Yeah.
So if you are a counselor, a therapist, case manager, social worker, or just anyone that delivers any kind of skill, strategy, intervention, take a look at the neurocounseling literature as well. Neurocounseling is basically infusing neuroscience into counseling practice. And it doesn't have to necessarily always be like you're a therapist or counselor, but neurocounseling literature also stresses the importance between the mind-body connection, understanding what's going on in the brain, how that impacts our body, our mood, our behaviors, and it also takes into account biological factors. We've talked a lot about biological factors in this series, blood sugar dysregulation, hormone issues, neurological factors, so neuroscience, psychological, social, and physiological factors. So neurocounseling, huge topic to be aware of. And the last topic, why we're on the neuroscience kick, is another field that I've given talks on, and I hope we look back in a few years and we see that we're moving in this direction. Psychoneuroimmunology is where it's at, in my opinion, if you want to understand illness, diseases, and disorders. Psychoneuroimmunology is a field of study. It's been around for a good handful of decades now, but very little work has been done in the criminal justice system. There's one or two articles that are talking about it. I'm weaving it into more talks. Psychoneuroimmunology is an integrative discipline. It's a mind-body connection. It takes into account the psycho component, psychology, the neuroscience, the immunology, which is basically our immune system, how nutrition factors into this, how our activity levels factor into our mood and energy in our body, so sedentary behaviors versus people who exercise, stress factors, social cognitive factors. And there's actually a couple journals dedicated to publishing research on this. So if you are in the medical arena, you probably have heard of this. If you're in the criminal justice arena, you probably have never heard of this. And in the mental health arena, there's a lot of articles written on this for mental health providers, but as far as I know, there's not too many trainings out there for mental health professionals to learn about that field of study. So very important, not just to study neuroscience, but all the other moving parts.
Great tip, Jerrod. And if you're an undergraduate or grad student looking to carve out a niche, there you go. Jerrod, let's circle back to the topic du jour, that of behavioral profiling. We mentioned previously one of the goals of the show is to dispel myths and stereotypes. Maybe talk about some of the misconceptions around that practice of behavioral profiling.
There's a lot of misconceptions out there. There's a lot of disagreement in the field. There's a lot of different terms out there to describe this. It's not an exact science, and there's plenty of cases where criminal profilers have gotten it wrong. So this is not 100% accurate science. And I think a lot of people get their information about criminal profiling from wonderful movies that I love. Silence of the Lambs, probably my first exposure to criminal profiling I really wanted to be a profiler after watching that. The Bone Collector, another good movie. Seven, if you remember that movie. Kiss the Girls. If you've watched Criminal Minds, the TV show. I mean, these are all shows or movies that are definitely glamorizing and popularizing this field of study. Now, if you go by just the movies, there's going to be absolutely a ton of misconceptions. So just take that into account. If you dig deep in the weeds in the criminal profiling literature, let's talk briefly about the history. Depending on what article you look at, the history of criminal profiling may date back almost 500 years. Obviously, they didn't use that term, but there are documented accounts where there was potential profiling going on 500 plus years ago as it pertained to what was going on with witchcraft at that time. So really fascinating stuff. We might, in the future, Joe, and I don't know if this would be of interest to your audience, but maybe dissecting what's known and what's not known with Jack the Ripper case. That's an early account of criminal behavioral profiling is Jack the Ripper case, which Jack the Ripper, they still don't know for sure who did it. They suspect now with DNA, but I'm not going to get into that today. But Jack the Ripper killed a number of prostitutes in, I believe, the late 1800s in London's East End, and they used criminal profiling. Not the same as today, but they did. So when you think of criminal profiling or profiling in general, a lot of terms that are thrown out there. Let's just talk about profiling in general. What does this term really mean? It's an investigative tool. It's an investigative aid that sometimes law enforcement agencies, federal agencies use, other kinds of agencies that may work with a profiler who has training in this area, and they're working with the investigative team because maybe the investigative team is running into dead ends. They don't have a lot of leads, so a profiler comes in, takes a look at all the available evidence, maybe it's crime scene photos and reviewing records, maybe it's interviewing other individuals, trying to maybe gather data and create a profile of a known or unknown suspect where it can be used to maybe generate more leads and create opportunities to apprehend an unknown assailant. A lot of times profiling is used in more serial offenses rather than like a one-time kind of off event. A lot of times people think profiling is only used with serial killer cases. Profiling is used with all kinds of different kinds of cases. Profilers do all kinds of different kinds of work. They can consult, they may train, they may work directly with teams, they may work for a government agency. So the work that profilers do, it's kind of all over the map. Joe, I'll stop there for a second before I introduce people to some of the different kinds of profiling that's out there.
I am just taking copious notes here, and I've got a question for you, but I want to save it maybe towards the end of the interview. So proceed with your line of thought, and I'm going to tuck my question in my back pocket.
So some of the terms, there's a lot of terms out there, depending on what kind of profile it is. You might hear the term behavioral analyst. That's a term that does come up in this literature. You will also hear the term behavioral analyst units. So behavioral analyst units, depending on what state or even what country somebody's in, they may use different terms. Behavioral analyst units, and again, I don't know all the ins and outs of every country, but that's a term that you might find in Canada. There are crime scene profiling techniques, so someone would maybe go to the crime scene, look at the crime scene photos. They really pay attention to the mode of death. We talked about this in the profile we did on, I believe, Ted Bundy. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe. Where one of the things that led to his apprehension was bite mark analysis. When we talked about Albert Fish, the crime scene's gruesome, removing a body part. So crime scene profiling, you're going to pay attention to all of these kinds of things. Geographic profiling is another term that's talked about in the profiling literature. So geographic profiling, really paying attention to patterns, locations, just paying attention to travel, distance between different crime scenes. They really kind of map out kind of on a grid or a map using electronic databases where they can help maybe target profiling of where the crime scenes have happened and trying to connect the dots. There's psychological profiling. I think that's kind of part of what we're doing. I'm in the early stages of putting together some trainings on my knowledge of profiling and then infusing the biology and the neuroscience. So I'm really going to call it like criminal neurobiobehavioral profiling. So I'm taking my psychology hat and merging it with my neuroscience and my biology and my chemistry hat. I think that can help us better understand complex human behavior. There's suspect-based profiling. Some of you that may do work in, like, unfortunately, suicide arenas, psychological autopsies is a whole line of literature that you might want to just become familiar with. By no means is that all the terms that you're going to find out there, but those are some of the major ones that come up in the literature. There's all kinds of data that criminal profilers use depending on the case. They're going to look at victim offender profiles. That is very, very important when we talk about some of the profiles we've done with serial killers, because all serial killers are different. There's different victim offender profiles. So examples would be maybe one serial killer targets just females. Maybe another serial killer targets men. Maybe another serial killer targets just children. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, really targeted anyone. So sometimes there's clear victim offender profiles, and other times there's not. And when there's not, that makes it even more tricky, and that's when maybe a profiler will come in, and maybe there's no apparent connection, but maybe they dig deeper in the weeds and they examine all kinds of data and they interview people and they talk to the investigators. Maybe they could find some of those other variables that may not be as clear to whoever's working on the case. So, Joe, I'll park the brakes there and kick it back to you.
You mentioned this earlier, Jerrod, and it sounds like the same approach I take, for example, when I'm training folks on, introducing folks even to the risk-need responsivity framework. Just to help illustrate, I'll use, for example, a high-risk client who's riddled with criminogenic need, and even though a probation officer may not deal with that high-risk client a lot, there's still value in there to get them to see, okay, but this is what my medium and low risk clients will look like, sort of, again, to a lesser extent. And I think that's the approach you're taking with this profiling talk is you're likely never going to have a serial killer on your caseload, or you'll likely never interact with one in the justice sphere. But could you maybe take that same approach and make those connections or provide those practical applications for a probation officer, a parole officer, a corrections official, or criminal justice player to, like I said, help illustrate for them what they might see on a smaller scale with these trends, like you said earlier, even getting back to the prenatal area or time of an individual's life?
I think so, yes. So like criminal profiling, I mean, again, a lot of it, if we think serial killers, but criminal profilers may profile serial rapists, arson-related crimes, mass homicide events. Again, those of you listening to this, I assume most of you are not working with folks that are engaging in mass homicide events and serial killing, and you're not going out to a crime scene because you're working with an active client. So you might not be doing that part of it, but if you understand the science behind criminal profiling, and you understand psychological profiling, you understand victim-offender relationships, you may understand the importance of the neuroscience component, the biological factors. I think it gives you more of a holistic understanding of human behavior. Now, you're not going to go out and probably profile per se. And a lot of times profiling is done after the offense has taken place. But we're kind of, again, reverse engineering and taking some of these principles, not all of them, and we're infusing some other principles that aren't often talked about in this. Psychoneuroimmunology, the neuroscience component, the biology, the biochemistry. We're taking all these principles and hopefully equipping us with more tools. We have a better magnifying glass where we can look at maybe some of these subtle red flag indicators and connect the dots. And maybe they're not as subtle after we really understand neuroscience research, or we understand the gut or the HPA axis. And maybe those subtle things now have moved up to the top of the list as a target area. And I'll give you an example. How many probation officers truly think about energy drink consumption, meal skipping, as we talked about, digestive health issues, circadian rhythm misalignment, daytime fatigue? All of those are just glaring at me that this client, their brain and body is not functioning at optimal levels, which places them at greater risk for maybe relapse on drugs or alcohol. Maybe they're more prone to having self-control deficits. If you can really understand the science between some of these things that maybe you've never considered, and you move that to the top of the list, and getting your client referred to a sleep specialist, someone to help target the gut, amazing things can happen with your client's mood and behavior, and they may actually be way more successful in a COG skills group and being more successful with complying with the recommendations of the court. So that's kind of my 2 cents there that help.
Yeah, that was great, Jerrod. I love that. When you were speaking, you mentioned the term magnifying glass, as in equipping practitioners with a magnifying glass. And I started thinking, you could also almost make the argument it's about not so much a magnifying glass, but getting the practitioner to broaden that lens from which they view their populations. Almost, if I'm remembering my high school photography class properly, adjusting the aperture of that lens to broaden it out, to look at all of these things that they're simply not on their radar yet, and then connecting those dots.
Think about another analogy comes to mind. You got a big puzzle, and you got a nice flat table, and you got this puzzle, all these puzzle pieces that just fell out of the box, and they're everywhere. And looking at that, and maybe you've been through this whole series with us, and you're hearing all these new topics, and that's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for me to think about this. But if you take a step back And maybe you're not putting that puzzle together by yourself, but you have a whole group of friends sitting around that table, and you're working as a team. It's a lot easier to take all these pieces and put together that puzzle. And the team in the professional arena could be the criminal justice professional, working with the mental health provider, working with the nutritionist, working with the sleep provider, working with a sensory processing, whoever, exercise specialist. Because human behavior is complex, and it's even more complex, in my opinion, when we're talking about folks that have had a ton of tough stuff happen to them before they're born and in early childhood. So we need to do it as a multidisciplinary team from a holistic mind-body approach. And if we can put that puzzle together, what happens? We can make a more informed intervention plan where then hopefully that breaks the revolving door of that client in and out of jail, in and out of prison, technical violations, bombing out of treatment, missing your appointments over and over and over again. And I've done probation work in the past. I've supervised people on house arrest. Like you, Joe, I didn't know much about this back then. If I could take what I know now and go back in time, I would have probably been more patient, approached it differently, asked for help. Some clients might have been outside of the scope of what I could do and get other providers to help. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that, Joe.
I'm going to steal this metaphor from my good friend Jonathan Lay over in the United Kingdom, but as you're describing it, Jerrod, this is Jonathan's metaphor, it's almost as if we need to create a pit crew for our clients. And we've had maybe one person in the pit crew, the probation officer, and another person in the pit crew, a mental health provider, but they're not all working together on the same vehicle. We need to take this all of the above approach. And as you said, not only have the probation officer that's great at what they do around risk, need, responsivity, and maybe even, best case scenario, desistance, but they need a member of the pit crew that knows about traumatic brain injury. They need a member of that pit crew that knows about trauma and ACEs and the gut brain health. And I think it's a matter of, we have all the pit crew members out there, but they never talk to each other. And that's why folks aren't succeeding in the justice system.
Huge. I love that analogy. I'll take it one step deeper. I am a certified functional nutritionist, and I am in school for another master's degree in applied clinical nutrition. People ask, why in the world are you doing that? I'm a major fan of functional approaches. So if you have your pit crew, but they don't have a functional lens, and they're only looking at the symptom, that's the leaf of the problem. A functional approach, you're getting deep into the weeds, you're getting into the trenches, and you're looking at the root. So if you work with a client who's constantly relapsing on drugs and alcohol, that's the leaf of the problem. If you have a client that has anger control issues, that's just the leaf of the problem. You peel back those layers, what do we often find? Executive function impairment, self-control deficits, tough family upbringing, maybe some fractured attachment, lots of childhood trauma. Have you peeled back the layers of that? A lot of times people think, okay, we've gone back to childhood, that's good enough. That's nowhere close. You got to peel back the layers to what happened in utero. Crime begins in utero in a lot of cases. People may push back on me on that, but from my neurocriminology lens, if you want to prevent crime from happening, target healthy pregnancies, the research says. A pregnancy free from drugs, alcohol, tobacco, good eating practices, all common sense things. The neurocriminology literature talks about really understanding it from conception. And one other term, a field of study that you want to be aware of if you do want to understand that, is the first 1,000 days of life research. That's day 1 of conception all the way to the age of 2. The research says that's the most critical point of brain and body development. So the first 1,000 days of life research, definitely take a look at that, regardless of what field of study you're in.
Jerrod, could you give us just a few more things to think about in the realm of criminal profiling before we wrap it up today?
Yeah, so when you think of criminal profiling, a lot of moving parts. We're just scratching the surface today. Criminal profilers may come at it from different angles. There's different approaches, where that profile was trained, what state they're in, what country they're in. But they can be a vital asset to a criminal investigation. When you study criminal profiling, a couple other things you'd want to think about, and a lot of times this is talked about within the context of serial killing, but not always, but understanding the differences between organized offenders and disorganized offenders. We've kind of tackled that a little bit in some of our profiles. If you truly want to learn about criminal profiling from a crime scene perspective, there's some really good articles out there that talk about all of the potential crime scene characteristics just to be aware of if you're wanting to get into this kind of work. You might want to look at some of the literature on bite marks. That is a fascinating line of literature that people don't think about. If you look at the bite mark literature, it talks about it might be something to consider in some homicide cases, sexual assault cases, and in some cases, child abuse cases. Looking at some of the dismemberment literature as well, we've talked a little bit about that during some of our talks. And being aware, if you want to study this from like a serial killer lens, be aware of some of those post-homicidal behaviors, disposals of the bodies, crime scene tagging, insertion of a foreign object into the deceased individual, understanding the literature related to homicidal necrophilia. Just fascinating information, very disturbing too if you're not in this line of work. And one other term that I didn't bring up in this talk, but I believe I did in that intro to the serial killer talk we did previously, understanding signature behaviors too of serial killers. Their calling card. It's a unique kind of behavior that's unique to that individual. So there's a lot of other things, Joe, we could go down a rabbit hole, but that hopefully gives folks just a broad spectrum overview of the field of criminal profiling.
A fascinating topic, Jerrod. Thank you so much. As always, my friend, I'm going to load up the show notes of this episode with links to your amazing programs, up to and including your program on trauma, resiliency, and self-care strategies, which I can attest to as a graduate, as well as your Becoming a Neurocriminology-Informed Professional program, which I'm also endeavoring through right now. Both amazing programs. Again, I'll leave links for those programs in the show notes. Until next time, my friend, it's always fascinating chatting with you.
Likewise, thank you, Joe, so much, and thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. As we close today's fascinating episode of the Criminologist Podcast, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Jerrod Brown for joining us once again and providing such brilliant insights into the complex world of criminal behavioral profiling. Dr. Brown, your expertise and extensive research in forensic behavioral health, combined with your dedication to educating others, have truly illuminated the nuances and critical aspects of profiling beyond the sensationalized portrayals we often see in Hollywood. Today's conversation serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of broadening our human services lens. As practitioners dedicated to serving our clients to the best of our ability, embracing interdisciplinary approaches, including the emerging fields of neuroscience and neurocriminology, is paramount. Dr. Brown's discussion on the role of neuroscience in understanding criminal behavior underscores the need for a more integrated approach in our work, one that encompasses the biological, psychological, and social facets of individual behavior. This episode is yet another testament to our ongoing commitment to delve deeper, think critically, and apply a holistic perspective in our practice. By incorporating insights from neuroscience and acknowledging the complexity of human behavior, we can enhance our strategies, interventions, and ultimately, the outcomes for those we serve. I encourage all our listeners to continue exploring these interdisciplinary fields and consider how they can be integrated into your professional practice. The journey towards a more comprehensive understanding of criminal behavior is ongoing, and experts like Dr. Brown are leading the way in bridging the gap between traditional criminal justice methodologies and the innovative frontiers of neurocriminology. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your invaluable contributions to our field and for sharing your knowledge with us today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Let's keep pushing the boundaries of what we know, always striving to better serve our clients and communities with every piece of new knowledge we acquire. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, desistance from crime, or of course, our innovative TIDES program model. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on X, formerly known as Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. It made such an impact with me, Jerrod, that regular listeners of the show hear me talk about it all the time, that it really was foundational in the TIDES model that Nicole Kimberly Staley and I developed, our trauma-informed assistance model, because it just struck us both that this has to be a core component of this new approach we're taking.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.